The flight from New York to London was supposed to be smooth and peaceful, a quiet journey for Adrian Cole and his family. The young billionaire, known across the business world for his sharp mind and calm demeanor, was not used to losing control of any situation. Yet, as the hours passed, the private section of the plane filled with the sound of his baby daughter's cries, and for the first time, Adrian felt helpless. The child's wailing cut through the hum of the engines, piercing the calm atmosphere. His wife Emily sat beside him, pale from exhaustion, gently rocking their daughter in her arms. She whispered softly, tried singing, even offered her a small blanket, but nothing seemed to soothe the tiny, red-faced infant. Around them, the passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances of pity and frustration. The flight attendants, trained to handle everything from turbulence to tantrums, rushed back and forth offering suggestions, a bottle, a pacifier, a warm cloth. Adrian accepted everything they brought, desperate for silence. But the baby's cries only grew louder. He looked at his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes, though he wasn't expecting anything from it. The glowing numbers seemed useless. Time had slowed, stretching painfully with each sob that came from his daughter's lips. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not from embarrassment, but from fear. "I don't know what's wrong with her," she whispered, her voice cracking. Adrian's heart clenched at the sight of her trembling hands. He had built empires, solved crises, and made million-dollar decisions in minutes. But here, in this small cabin, miles above the ground, he couldn't help the person who mattered most. "It's okay," he murmured, trying to stay calm, though frustration crept into his tone. He rubbed his temple, exhaustion clouding his thoughts. The attendants tried once more to assist, suggesting that maybe the change in air pressure was hurting the baby's ears. Adrian nodded and tried everything they recommended. He held her, walked the aisles, whispered softly, but the crying didn't stop. The sound began to attract attention, even from the front cabin. A few passengers frowned, others sighed loudly, but no one said anything. Everyone knew who Adrian Cole was, a man whose face appeared on magazine covers and news reports, a symbol of wealth and influence. Yet now, he looked nothing like the confident figure from television. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his expression defeated. Emily leaned against his shoulder, rocking their daughter as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Maybe she's in pain," she said softly. "Maybe we should have stayed home." Adrian didn't answer. He could only look at his child and feel a strange ache he couldn't explain, a mix of love, worry, and the sharp sting of helplessness. For once in his life, money, status, and all the power he carried meant nothing. The problem before him wasn't one that could be solved by wealth. The plane continued through the night sky, the cries echoing through the cabin, while somewhere in the back, a pair of kind, aging eyes began to watch with quiet understanding. At the very back of the plane, far from the luxury and soft lights of the first-class cabin, sat an elderly woman named Clara. Her seat was narrow, the cushion worn thin, and her small bag rested beneath her feet. Her clothes were simple, a faded brown coat and an old scarf wrapped neatly around her neck. Her hands, marked by years of work, rested gently in her lap as she looked out the window at the endless stretch of clouds below. She was on her way home after spending a week with her grandchildren, a visit that had filled her heart even as it emptied her wallet. Despite the fatigue in her eyes, they still carried a quiet warmth, the kind that came from a lifetime of giving more than receiving. As the minutes passed, she noticed the growing restlessness in the air, sighs, whispers, the shuffle of impatient feet. The baby's cries from the front of the plane had started softly, but now they filled the cabin, raw and aching. Clara could hear the distress in the child's voice, but what she really heard was something deeper, the exhaustion of a mother trying her best, and the helplessness of a father who was used to solving everything except this. Clara adjusted her scarf, watching as one of the flight attendants rushed by again, balancing a bottle and a small blanket. The young woman's polite smile had started to fade, replaced by uncertainty. A few passengers exchanged glances, shaking their heads or muttering under their breath. "Can't they do something?" someone whispered. But Clara didn't feel frustration. She felt empathy. She had been that mother once, many years ago, sitting in a crowded train with a child who wouldn't stop crying, her own face red with shame. She remembered strangers' stares, the judgment, the helplessness. That memory stirred something inside her now. As the baby's wails grew louder, Clara sighed softly and reached for her cane. She stood up slowly, her joints protesting with every movement. The flight attendant nearest her turned quickly, surprised. "Ma'am, please, you should remain seated," the woman said gently, trying to be polite. Clara gave her a reassuring smile. "It's all right, dear," she replied in a calm, steady voice that carried unexpected confidence. "I think I can help." There was something in her tone that made the attendant pause. Perhaps it was the certainty, or maybe it was the kindness that radiated from her like sunlight through clouds. For a moment, hesitation flickered in the attendant's eyes, but she nodded and stepped aside. The other passengers watched curiously as Clara made her way down the aisle, leaning slightly on her cane, but walking with surprising grace. Every step she took seemed to quiet the space around her, as though the air itself was waiting to see what she would do. Up ahead, Adrian and his wife looked up in confusion as the frail old woman approached. No one knew who she was, but there was something about her, something calm, something familiar, that made even the most skeptical passengers hold their breath. And as she reached the crying baby, the chaos of the plane seemed to fade into silence, replaced by a strange, comforting stillness that no one could explain. Clara moved slowly down the aisle, her cane tapping softly against the floor with each careful step. The hum of the airplane seemed to fade beneath the sound of the baby's cries, which had grown desperate and sharp, echoing through every corner of the cabin. Passengers turned their heads, whispering to one another, confused about what the old woman was doing. She looked fragile, out of place among the luxury around her, yet something about her presence felt steady, calm in the middle of chaos. When she finally reached the front, the young mother looked up, startled by the stranger standing beside her. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from exhaustion. She clutched her baby tightly, as if afraid that even kindness might judge her. Clara gave her a small, reassuring smile, her voice barely above a whisper, as she said, "May I?" For a brief moment, silence filled the space between them. Adrian stared, uncertain, his businessman instincts torn between hesitation and hope. His wife met his gaze, then looked at Clara's eyes. They were kind, patient, filled with something she hadn't seen all day, understanding. Without a word, she nodded and gently handed over her crying daughter. The old woman's hands, though wrinkled and thin, were steady and sure. She held the baby close to her chest, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. At first, the baby continued to cry, her tiny fists flailing in protest, but Clara didn't flinch. She began to hum a soft old tune that seemed older than memory itself. It wasn't loud. It didn't even rise above the sound of the plane's engines, but something about it was different. The melody was warm and tender, weaving through the air like a gentle whisper of love. It was the kind of song that mothers sing when words fail, when comfort has to come from the heart instead. Gradually, the baby's cries began to weaken, the high-pitched wails melting into small hiccups and then soft sighs. The passengers leaned forward, watching in disbelief. Even the flight attendants, frozen near the aisle, could only stare. Within minutes, the once screaming child had nestled her head against Clara's shoulder, her breathing deep and even, her tiny hands clutching the old woman's scarf. The cabin, moments ago filled with frustration and noise, now felt peaceful, almost sacred. The hum of the engines sounded softer, the tension in the air had lifted. and for the first time since the flight began, everyone could breathe again. Adrian's wife covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes, as she whispered, "How did you do that?" Clara looked down at the sleeping child, her lips curving into a smile. "Sometimes," she said gently, "they just need to feel love." She didn't say it as advice or wisdom, it was simply truth, spoken by someone who had carried the weight of years and still believed in the quiet power of compassion. Adrian sat frozen in his seat, hardly believing what he was seeing. Just moments ago, his baby's cries had filled the plane like a storm that refused to end. Now, she was fast asleep, resting peacefully in the arms of a woman he had never met. The change felt unreal, too sudden, too gentle to explain. He had spent hours trying everything money could buy, but nothing had worked. Yet here was this old woman, dressed in simple clothes, holding his daughter as if she had known her all her life. The baby's tiny hand clutched the fabric of Clara's scarf, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Adrian's wife leaned closer, watching with quiet awe, afraid to even breathe too loudly and break the spell that had fallen over the cabin. For the first time since the flight began, there was no noise, no tension, only stillness. The hum of the airplane faded into the background, and in its place came something softer, something sacred. Clara sat there, her posture relaxed, her eyes lowered to the sleeping child in her arms. Her lips moved slightly, forming words too quiet for anyone else to hear. The faint melody of her voice blended with the rhythm of the engines, creating a calm that spread through the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. The mother leaned forward, curiosity touching her voice. "What are you singing?" she asked softly, afraid to disturb the peace that had settled between them. Clara smiled, her eyes shimmering with memory. "It's a song my mother used to sing to me during storms," she said. "It always made me feel safe." Her voice carried warmth that no amount of wealth or luxury could imitate, the kind of warmth that came only from love freely given, without expecting anything in return. Adrian felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years: humility. He had built his life on power, decisions, and numbers. But as he looked at this woman, her lined face glowing softly under the cabin lights, he realized how small all of that was compared to this moment. Every passenger nearby sat in silence, their earlier frustration forgotten. The scene before them was simple, yet deeply moving: an elderly woman and a sleeping baby, surrounded by peace that no one could explain. Even the flight attendants stood quietly, their hands clasped, their eyes softened. It wasn't just that the noise had stopped, it was the feeling that something good, something rare, had touched them all. Clara looked out the window for a moment, her reflection faint in the glass, a woman who had lived long enough to understand that kindness didn't need grand gestures or rewards. Sometimes it was just the act of holding on when someone else couldn't. The plane continued through the clouds, steady and calm, but for those who witnessed that moment, it felt like more than just a smooth flight. It felt like grace, the quiet kind that asks for nothing and gives everything. Clara held the baby in her arms for a while longer, humming softly as the little one slept without a single sound. When the plane's lights dimmed and most passengers began to settle in, she leaned forward and gently handed the sleeping child back to her mother. The young woman smiled with tears still glistening in her eyes, whispering a quiet thank you that carried more emotion than words could hold. Clara nodded kindly and began to make her way back down the aisle toward her seat, moving slowly with the help of her cane. But before she could take more than a few steps, Adrian spoke. "Please," he said, standing slightly from his seat, "won't you sit with us for a while?" Clara paused, unsure at first, her modesty urging her to decline. She wasn't used to sitting among people like him, people whose shoes probably cost more than everything she owned. But something in his voice was different. It wasn't the tone of a businessman used to giving orders. It was a request, gentle, sincere, and full of respect. After a small hesitation, Clara nodded. "All right," she said softly, and took the seat beside them. The next hour passed, not in silence, but in quiet conversation. The world outside the windows was a blur of stars and endless clouds. But inside that small cabin, something genuine began to grow, a connection that crossed generations, wealth, and circumstance. Adrian asked about her family, and Clara smiled as she spoke about her grandchildren, how they loved painting, and how she saved coins every month to buy them colors and brushes. She didn't speak about her life with sadness or self-pity, even though her hands and eyes revealed a lifetime of hard work. Instead, she spoke with gratitude, describing small joys: a morning sunrise, a neighbor's kindness, the laughter of a child. "I don't have much," she said with a smile, "but I have enough to love, and that's what matters." Adrian listened intently, realizing how rare it was for him to hear someone talk without expecting anything in return. When he spoke about his business, she nodded politely, but didn't seem impressed by the size of his company or the number of people he employed. "You must be proud," she said gently. "But tell me, do you have time to be happy?" The question caught him off guard. He couldn't answer immediately, because deep down, he wasn't sure. Clara smiled knowingly and looked down at her hands. "You see, kindness," she said, "is the only wealth we carry forever. Everything else, money, power, fame, it fades when we do. But what you do for others, that stays behind." Her words lingered in his mind long after she finished speaking. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, not control, but humility. The engines hummed softly around them as they continued to talk. Two strangers who seemed destined to meet at 30,000 feet, teaching each other something neither could find on the ground. When the tires of the plane finally touched the ground, a wave of relief swept through the cabin. The once tense flight had ended in unexpected calm, and as the passengers gathered their belongings, several of them turned to look at the small figure who had brought peace to the air. Clara stood slowly, adjusting her old scarf, ready to leave quietly. But before she could take a step, someone began to clap. Then another joined, and soon the entire cabin filled with applause. It wasn't for the landing. It was for her. The flight attendants smiled warmly, their eyes shining, and even those who had earlier grumbled now looked at her with respect and gratitude. Adrian and his wife rose from their seats. Emily, still holding her now sleeping baby, rushed forward and wrapped her arms around the elderly woman. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You have no idea what this meant to us." Clara's smile was gentle and knowing, her voice soft as she replied, "Every child just needs a little love." The passengers began to file out, but Adrian stayed behind, standing before her with a strange mixture of admiration and guilt. For the entire flight, he had watched this woman do what he, with all his wealth and connections, could not. He pulled out his wallet and took a thick envelope from inside. "Please," he said, his voice low, "take this. It's just a small thank you." He tried to place the envelope in her hand, but Clara shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Cole," she said kindly. "Keep your money. Just promise me one thing." Adrian frowned, a little confused. "Anything," he said. Clara smiled faintly and touched the baby's small hand. "Promise me," she said, "that you'll always listen when your child cries. Sometimes they don't just need help, they need to know someone cares." Her words landed softly, but deeply, settling in his heart in a way nothing else could. He stood silent, unable to respond. For the first time, the man who had built skyscrapers and led companies felt small in the best possible way. He nodded slowly, his voice catching as he said, "I promise." Clara gave a final smile, picked up her small bag, and began walking toward the exit. Her steps were steady but slow, her figure shrinking as she disappeared down the narrow aisle, outside the plane. The sun was setting, painting the runway in soft gold. Adrian stood at the top of the stairs, watching her merge into the crowd of travelers, a simple woman with nothing but kindness in her hands, yet richer than anyone he had ever met. His wife touched his arm and whispered, "Let's go." He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying Clara's words again and again. He realized then that what she had given them wasn't just peace during a flight, it was a lesson that would last a lifetime. And as he carried his sleeping daughter in his arms, he finally understood what it truly meant to listen. Weeks passed, but Adrian Cole could not shake the image of the elderly woman from his mind. The sound of her voice, the calmness in her eyes, and the wisdom in her words had settled deep in his heart, like an echo that refused to fade. Even in his busy office, surrounded by luxury and the constant noise of meetings, something felt different. The world that once revolved around profit now felt strangely hollow. Late one night, as he sat in his office looking out at the city lights, he opened his briefcase and found the small blanket his daughter had been wrapped in during the flight. The faint scent of lavender still lingered, the same soothing smell that had surrounded Clara. It was enough to make up his mind. The next morning, he asked his assistant to find the community center she had mentioned, the place she said she worked part-time. It took hours, but when they finally found it, Adrian was shocked by what he saw. The building was old and worn, its paint peeling, its windows cracked. The sign above the entrance was faded, and the playground nearby had rusted swings and a single broken slide. Yet, as he stepped closer, laughter drifted from inside, the sound of children, pure and joyful, cutting through the air like music. He stood quietly at the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. Inside, Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a group of children. Her face glowed with warmth as she helped them paint colorful paper flowers. Her clothes were as simple as before, the same faded brown coat and patterned scarf, but there was something beautiful about her simplicity. She moved from child to child, encouraging them softly, her laughter blending with theirs. Adrian watched, humbled. This was a woman who had so little, yet gave so much. She didn't need wealth or recognition. She only needed love, and she gave it freely. He realized then that her strength didn't come from comfort or privilege, but from a heart that knew what truly mattered. When she finally stood to stretch, he quietly turned and walked away before she could see him. He didn't want her thanks or her attention. He wanted to do something that would last, something worthy of the kindness she had shown. A week later, the community center received a letter with no name, just a note and a check large enough to rebuild the entire place. The staff was shocked, and Clara, upon reading the letter, smiled quietly as her eyes filled with tears. The note said simply, "For the woman who taught me that love is the greatest wealth." She held the paper close to her heart, her mind drifting back to the flight and the man whose eyes had been full of worry and pride. She whispered softly. He listened. Outside, children continued to play, their laughter filling the air, and for Clara, that was all the reward she ever needed. Months later, the small community center that had once stood cracked and crumbling was alive with color and laughter. Bright new walls replaced the worn ones. The playground outside gleamed with fresh paint, and the air was filled with the happy noise of children running, learning, and dreaming. At the center of it all sat Clara, dressed in her usual simple clothes, her scarf carefully wrapped and her eyes shining with quiet disbelief. She had never imagined she would live to see this place renewed. The day of the reopening ceremony had arrived, and the townspeople gathered to celebrate the woman whose love had touched so many lives. Banners fluttered in the gentle wind, and children held handmade cards that said, "Thank you, Miss Clara." She smiled at each one, her heart swelling with gratitude, as she was guided to the small stage at the front. She didn't notice the familiar faces sitting quietly in the back row, Adrian Cole, his wife Emily, and their little daughter, who now giggled happily in her mother's arms. They had come not as honored guests, but as humble witnesses to the change one woman's kindness had created. When Clara was invited to speak, she hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she held the microphone. She wasn't used to attention or speeches. She had lived her life quietly, believing that good deeds needed no audience. But when she looked out at the faces of the children she loved, her voice found its strength. "Sometimes," she began softly, "the smallest kindness changes the biggest hearts." The crowd fell silent, listening closely as her words echoed through the hall. "I've learned that you don't need to have much to give," she continued. "Love doesn't cost anything, but it can make the world rich. A kind word, a patient hand, a smile, they can change someone's day, sometimes even someone's life." She paused, her eyes glistening. "We all have something to give, no matter who we are." In the crowd, Adrian felt his chest tighten with emotion. He looked at the woman standing on stage, the same woman who had once comforted his crying child thousands of feet in the air, and realized she would never know how deeply she had changed him. Since that flight, he had begun spending more time at home, listening to his daughter's laughter, holding her when she cried, learning what it meant to love without control. His wife reached over and squeezed his hand, their eyes meeting with shared understanding. When the ceremony ended, the crowd clapped, and Clara smiled modestly. As she stepped off the stage, she noticed a small child walking toward her, the same baby she had once held. The little girl reached out her hand, eyes bright and full of trust, as if she somehow remembered the comfort of those arms long ago. Clara bent down and hugged her, whispering, "Hello again, little one." The sunlight spilled through the windows, wrapping them both in golden light. She had no idea that the quiet kindness she once offered on a plane had forever changed a man's heart, a family's future, and perhaps, in a small way, the world itself. True wealth, she had proven, was not found in fortune. It was found in love, freely given.